Okay, everybody's getting settled. I hope everyone's not passing out after lunch, that nice late European lunch. Shutting the doors, locking everyone in, no one here gets out alive. So, hi, I'm Cliff Bleszinski. I'm the CEO of Boss Key Productions, and when I was asked to come back to Reboot, because I was here last year and had in Split, honestly, and had a great time, and this year it's bigger and better and more awesome. Dubrovnik's lovely, and I appreciate everyone having me here. I started cobbling this talk together and thinking about kind of a general theme of how I could kind of take the smattering of my thoughts and kind of put it together. And, Demir was kind of asking for provocative titles that sounded interesting. My awesome art director, Tramel's talk is called Why I Hate My Job. And mine is ultimately AAA, game devs, and virtual reality walk into a bar, which sound like a bunch of things that aren't really related, but trust me, at the end of this journey, I'll hopefully tie it all together. I got a cool clicker, so I can walk around the stage and not be frozen to the podium. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of an intro, kind of explain who I am, a little bit of my history if you're not familiar with my work, and how creaky the stage is. And talk about the state of AAA gaming, which is very interesting and unique right now in 2017 and beyond. Then talk about the care and feeding of the unique creature that is the game developers. As we all know, we're all a bunch of weird bastards. And then talk about the state of VR. VR for me is like Nintendo. I love it so much that when I see it screw up, I get very angry and very passionate. And then kind of wrap it up with a little bit of obvious free advice. And if we have a little bit of time, a couple questions and answers. Click. So this is part one, the intro. I didn't have really a graphic for this, so you get to see my dog. So I have a new look. Over the years, I've kind of had varying looks of stupid red, purple hair and things like that. And one of the things I've learned being visible in tech over the years, in doing interviews and on camera and whatnot, is as you get a little bit older, if you've been in this business for a while, such as I have, you got to switch it up. Because if you keep trying to look like the 22-year-old version of yourself, people are just going to call you out on the industry aging you. I joked that when I started the studio, it'd wind up being like Barack Obama, and the fact that it would age me. And now, about a year and a half ago, I looked in the mirror, and the first little gray hairs started popping up, just like the president. So gotta love that. So this look is, I call it like trashy Pitbull, or Mr. Worldwide. So if the look keeps going, hopefully turn into Ragnar Lothbrok. Which at the end of the day is a little bit better than, boy band punchable face Cliff. Or I kind of look like a condom ad, actually. So I started making games when I was 17 years old. It's been a while. When I actually looked at the clock, it's ultimately been about 25 years now, so a long way from when I was a teenager, filled with angst, making games, adventure games like Creaky Stage, version 1, Palace of Deceit, which was a game where you were a little bit dragon, kind of trying to escape from a castle with an evil wizard, and then ultimately Dare to Dream, which was a very strange adventure game that sold all of about 5 copies, and ultimately Jazz Jackrabbit, which people still ask me about to this day. So 25 years of doing this, not my first rodeo, still learning as I go. So 25 years in this industry is a long time. You could say I'm an old soul, I'm an old bastard. The funny thing was, on the way over, my wife and I had seen the majority of the films that were available, and she hadn't seen the 80s classic, the Ron Howard film Cocoon, which is about a bunch of old people in South Florida who find this pool that's filled with these mysterious pods that kind of gives them renowned youth and whatnot. And it's one of those things that ultimately winds up turning out that it winds up being somewhat vampiric. So surrounding myself with younger developers, it's kind of like getting a new dog when you have the old dog and the puppy. The older dog suddenly has more energy. So by being around younger developers, I feed off of your energy and hopefully suck the life out of you. So I've worked on a bunch of games, obviously Jazz, the Unreal Tournament series, of course Gears. Gears was a great, very important time in my career and my adult life. And for those of you that don't know, I helped out a bunch on Bulletstorm. The remaster recently came out through my friends at Gearbox. I helped out with the great Metroidvania game Shadow Complex, Unreal 2, and even Fortnite before I departed Epic Games. And I didn't really work much on Gears of War Judgment, so don't hold that against me. So why am I here? So first off, you can blame Becky and Demir, as they wrote me in last year and then this year for this. And obviously, coming to Dubrovnik, King's Landing is kind of a no-brainer. It's absolutely beautiful here if you haven't had a chance to be in town. And I like to travel. I don't remember Wednesday's art meeting where we were talking about what assets were going in the game, but I remember the trips to Europe, Croatia, and New York and whatnot. And I do love game developers, as I've been saying repeatedly. Pace it, Cliff. So I unretired 2 years ago, and I got really, really bored, and I really missed making stuff. And so we started the studio, Boss Key Productions, where over 2 years in, this summer it will be 3 years, which in tech is an eternity. And we have a very awesome first-person character-based gravity-defying combat shooter known as Lawbreakers, which should be coming out soon. More news in the coming months, of course. Plug. So I want to talk about the state of AAA, because it's in a really, really weird spot right now. And if you follow the journey I'll walk you through to kind of see where my opinion came from, I think you'll find it rather interesting. First off, in order to understand where I'm coming from, we need to talk about the concept of globalization and what that means in regards to games and how meat space, how environments get affected by stores and retail. I'm originally from the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, great area. I had a fantastic time growing up, and the image they sell you is, Mark Wahlberg and Ben Affleck films and, these great mafia films, but it's really about shoveling a whole bunch of snow. So those of you from the Nordic areas can certainly see and appreciate that it gets pretty rough in the winter. So when I was a child, my family would go to Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall up there. If you have a chance to go to PAX East, I highly recommend visiting because it's a great area, lots of unique Boston foods that are available there, lobster rolls and whatnot. It's really awesome. When I was a kid, I used to go to the store there, and they had these amazing toys. Those of you who are mid to late 30s, early 40s may remember it was Shogun Warriors back in the day that I used to watch. These kind of Japanese animated cartoons about giant robots fighting giant monsters, which of course set the template for later Power Rangers, Voltron, and of course, as Guillermo del Toro said, Pacific Rim. And I couldn't afford these toys at the time. They had the die-cast metal ones that were 6 inches tall, all the way through to the 2-foot tall ones, and they were pretty impressive. So, at 15 years old, I moved to Southern California, quite the different scene from piling out of 18 pounds of snow. And that was a fun experience, a very good growing experience at 15. But a few years later, I went back to visit my old hometown outside of Boston, at Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall. And I wanted to go back now that I could afford to buy these toys to see if they even carried them, if they were at the point where they were still vintage. And what was in its place? A fucking Foot Locker. And it's like, well, why travel to these cities if it's just going to be the same stuff that's everywhere from point A to point B? And the point that I'm making with this is AAA is starting to kind of get to this point where it feels like the American restaurant scene, where in the States, you have a lot of these restaurants like your Applebee's, your Outback Steakhouse, your Cheesecake Factory, your Olive Gardens, and all of these, which, I mean, they're not bad, but they're not great. They're just kind of there. Salad and breadsticks, this is great, right? And so AAA, and these are all fantastic games, by the way. I'm not knocking them, but it feels like it's just this category of 8 games that we're getting repeatedly over and over again. And they're good games, but they're costing hundreds of millions of dollars to make and market. And what it kind of goes back to is this kind of classic Eddie Murphy movie called The Distinguished Gentleman, in which Eddie was this con man. And there was a congressional race that was running on at the time, and the gentleman who was in the lead for becoming the congressman in the elections dies, like a week or so before the election. And Eddie Murphy's character happens to have the same exact name as the guy. So Eddie, being the grifter he is, decides to run for office under the slogan, I can't remember what his name was right now, John Johnson or something, the name you know. And that's what AAA feels like right now. It's just, oh, well, Madden, I like that. GTA, let's buy that because I played the old ones, and I'm too scared to take a risk on a new game or a new IP. So we're in this interesting place, and the question is how did we get here to this mysterious location? Sorry for the wall of text, but I have to explain it and break it down. Those of you who watched South Park this year, if you saw the whole bit about member berries, talking about, what's old is new, my 10 to 15-year rule. Remember Chewbacca? Remember the Millennium Falcon? Malcolm? Remember these, right? That's kind of where we're at with AAA, where, I played the early Halos, and I remember Halo, now I'm going to play the new one, and I don't want to take a risk on a new thing. And part of it is that, your average game in your retail space, and even in digital download, costing a lot to make and market, $60 is still a lot of damn money for your average person. And to ask a person to make that bet multiple times a year, you're asking a lot of them out of their bank accounts, which is why, of course, used games still are a thing. You also have consumers who've been burnt repeatedly by games that ship, they're buggy, they have season passes, they have DLC, basically ways to keep the disc in the tray and keep milking the user over and over again to keep them playing their game and not playing the other one and not trading them in. The other thing that's a big factor here is you have a lot of these tremendously talented studios that are owned by somebody who has a nearly infinite amount of money. You have Guerrilla Games, who's so tremendously talented that Sony can afford to spend 7 years on Horizon Zero Dawn. And will it make money? It doesn't matter. It will sell PlayStations, and Sony will make money on the systems and the games and everything else that comes along with it. Look at Activision, and owning all of these Call of Duty studios. They can just keep that train churning every single year. And players also contribute to this because, you can't go back once you've had better graphics, once you've had a better feature set, once you've had 120 frames per second. So consumer expectation factors into that as well. And gamers are picky. They're smart. And at the end of the day, this is a nearly unsustainable model unless you're one of the established brands or companies like an Activision, a 2K, or a Sony. So when you look at Horizon Zero Dawn, as I said, Sony can afford to do that. Whereas you look at what happened with BioShock Infinite, and you had hundreds of developers over the course of a certain amount of years, that game taking forever to happen, Irrational ultimately shuts down because this is a business and you have to keep the darn lights on. So what do? I'm proposing that if you want to make games that aren't just indie darlings or cool little VR experiences, is this kind of new idea of not AAA but AA. And I was trying to find precedent of these experiences, and as I thought about it, there actually are a fair amount of them out there. Our friends at Digital Extremes that we co-developed Unreal Tournament with are crushing it with Warframe, which is having amazing numbers in the free-to-play market. Everyone said you can't do PvE in free-to-play, and lo and behold, they did, and suddenly they're rolling in it. Of course, our friends at Rocket League doing very, very well, and of course, Rust. These games that look and play great, but they pick their battles in regards to budget and marketing, and they're also digital and reasonably priced or free-to-play. And that's kind of what we're gunning for with Lawbreakers. When you look at the game, it looks AAA, but it's a multiplayer 5v5 character-based first-person shooter. We opted out of doing a campaign, moderately budgeted, and hopefully a price point that's not $60, which we're putting our heads together and figuring out what that point is going to be. And digital, of course. So how do you fund it? And honestly, there's Kickstarter, there's Fig, there's all these other ways to do it. But my advice, honestly, Tencent came along, this giant Chinese conglomerate. They bought me out of my options at Epic, which ironically gave me the freedom to be funded by their competitor Nexon, which is weird. But regardless, there's a lot of money in Asia that wants to look to make Western, European, and all these kinds of games. So see if you can find some partners with those folks. The other thing, and this is going to sound a little weird, but it really makes a lot of sense to either have a fantastic business person or representation. I have an agent that represents myself in the studio. He's from United Talent Agency. His name's Ophir Lupu. That's not him. That's Ari Gold, obviously. But when I say agent, you picture Ari Gold from Entourage, which usually makes you think they're kind of douchey and whatnot, but Ophir's a good guy. And then we have a lawyer. You need to get good representation. This is a business, and I will say later as I wrap this up and get all warm and fuzzy with all of you, it is family. But at the end of the day, we're commercial art. So make sure you have good attorneys, read everything you sign, have them vet it all. And I just use an image of Johnny Cochran, because when you say lawyer, you think of Johnny Cochran. So. And you have one shot to really pull this off if you're making a new IP. And I cite my talented friends at Raven, who made a great game a while back known as Singularity, where you could control time with a device in your hand. It was a great kind of BioShock Eastern European vibe to it, but it ultimately didn't do well because of maybe the marketing and whatnot, even though the ratings were good in the game. And now they've been kind of moved over to be one of the multi-headed hydras of the Call of Duty development cycle. And as much as Call of Duty is a good game, these games require multiple studios, much like the Ubisoft model. And for me, at least, in the studio that I'm at doing Boss Key, I don't want to be one of those people working on one aspect of a giant other AAA game. So, moving on. Talking about the care and feeding of game developers and some lessons I've learned working with folks like yourself over the last 25 years. So, who is this for? And you may initially assume it's just for a CEO of a company or anything like that, but it's not. It's for all different types of developers, the chief operating officers, the leads, producers, or just peers. Building this studio from scratch with a myriad of different people from other studios in all walks of life, we've had our share of challenges, and we're working through them, and so I can share a little bit of advice from that experience with all of you here. So the first thing, as you all know, we as game developers, we're the land of misfit toys. Go back to the old 60s, 70s stop-motion cartoon from Christmas where there was misfit toys with Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Go back to Toy Story 3 where there were those really strange, the little baby head doll and the spider bot. We're the weird ones. We weren't necessarily the ones always going to prom in high school or the big dance. We were away on our computers, and myself, even when it came to lunch period, I had 3 friends at the time of high school, and then they were in different lunch period than I was. So rather than sit alone and sad by myself, as kind of the John Hughes film would suggest, I decided to go to the library and start programming on the Apple IIes that were in there, which kind of led me to this path of where I am today. And you have to understand you're dealing with very complicated folks, the type of folks that will sit in front of a computer and crank on code or work on a 8 million polygon character, where we're weird people, and if you don't pay attention and listen and have a good relationship with these developers, the default state often for devs is negativity and cynicism, and you have to fight that on a daily basis. And at the end of the day, we're all too damn smart for our own good, and we tend to just overthink the crap out of everything. So one of the ways that I've managed to bond with Boss Key employees and whatnot is, making the rounds multiple times a day and checking in with people. Instead of immediately going to their desk and being like, are you being productive? What are you working on? Being like, hey, did you watch the football game last night? Or, Dan, my designer, is a big soccer fan. He loves Roma. And I'm always like, oh, how's your team doing? Or, we have various employees who are from the Louisiana area, and my wife's from New Orleans. And so, hey, were you able to go to the crawfish boil this week and whatnot? And kind of get to know everybody on a personal level. And then be like, oh, and what are you working on, by the way? And that way you kind of, break the ice. It's very simple stuff, but it's surprisingly effective. If you're an executive or a lead, try to not be in your own private office. There's the whole corner office with the big imposing desk of traditional corporate that everyone assumes have, your door always open as much as possible. If you are a lead or, higher up or whatnot, there will be confidential conversations that need to be had or phone calls. Occasionally that is okay to close the door, but generally speaking, keep the door open and ultimately understand that in many ways for these developers, you're almost like a therapist to them and kind of sometimes talking them down off a ledge or being an explorer that's pointing out that there's land beyond where you're going and that you will get there and that they should not keel haul you and knock you off the boat. The other thing is it's kind of like parenting. Sometimes, you don't want to tell a child, don't put your hand on the stove. Sometimes they need to learn that their own way. And it's one of those things that convince people to do the Jedi mind trick in a roundabout way of kind of knowing that, oh, this is a really interesting idea. And you're like, yeah, I kind of fed that into your brain and you came to your own conclusion. That way everybody's bought in. It's a little bit of a psychological trick, but it's fairly effective. But, it's the parenting thing of every time you say, do it just because I said so, the stick gets shorter every time you use it. And the phrase that I'm using at work lately is this the hill? Is this the hill you want to die on? Pick your battles. And that's been fairly effective as well. So I had a conversation a few years ago with the film director Eli Roth, and he was explaining what it's like to be a movie director. And actors are actually somewhat similar to game developers in the fact that they can be very needy, and they need a lot of attention and care and feeding and grooming and watering. And he told me that, he talked to one actor who's like, oh, my part's not that big. And the old saying, there's no small parts, only small actors. It's like, well, yeah, but you get to die in the wood chipper in Act 3, and that's awesome. And then they're happy with that. It's like, oh, you're the UI person that's just working on the widgets, but you're the gateway to the multiplayer. This is incredibly important for the game, and kind of reminding them that every single part is incredibly important. So, big advice here, and I've learned this one the hard way a couple times. Don't know if I could have fixed it, but we've lost a couple people who what I like to call headphones developers. From a management standpoint, this seems like this is a person, they don't rock the boat, they're not a rabble-rouser, they get their stuff done, but they have the headphones glued to their fucking head, and they're staring at the monitor whenever you walk in to the point where you have to go hello, anybody there? Take the headphones off. To the point where I want to have a headphone set where you could kind of change the light of green, come talk to me, yellow, only if you have food, and red, fuck off, which would be a very useful feature to have. But you have to check in with these folks because these are the types that if they have a problem with something, it will boil in their belly like a cancer. And one day they'll just be like, yeah, I'm leaving the studio. And you're like, what the hell? I had no idea because I didn't go out of my way to check in and I feel partially responsible in the odd chance that someone departs the studio because I hate it because I love everyone that works at the studio. So we're medium size, like I said, 65 or so folks, which is a really good size. We're not at the 400 developer, management to watch management. And remember, there's a fine line between being someone's boss and being their peer. At the end of the day, if someone truly consistently screws up or doesn't get their work done, there's a warning process, paperwork, performance plan. Ultimately, they may wind up getting let go, but you still want to have that kind of good relationship with them. And watch for the telephone game of human network. If someone's departing the studio, address it immediately with the company. Otherwise, without information, fear and uncertainty and doubt will creep in, and the game developers will go back to their default state of cynical. And watch out for cliques as well. Cliques, of course, being groups of people, the tribal nature of humanity. They tend to all get together in one room, or if they live nearby each other, or if their spouses and kids play together, and it becomes this kind of I hate the animators, they're dicks, is what the programmers say, that kind of stuff. You have to do whatever you can to switch up the seating, or make sure you have social outings, or pints on Thursdays, or anything like that to kind of keep people interacting and avoid that us versus them mentality that humans generally tend to do. So when you interact with different disciplines, artists, obviously very, very visually oriented. They're some of the easier ones to talk to in regards to kind of making the rounds. They're picky, and you have to remind them you're making commercial art and that they don't want to just be noodling on the same model for 2 months when they've been allocated 1 month. And the fact is, they have to remember that art isn't finished, it's only ever abandoned when they're making their happy little trees. And you can bond with them by kind of learning some of their heroes. There's this amazing 3D artist, Thor Frick, who worked at Machine Games, and he's now freelancing, and he's one of the best 3D modelers I know, and I send, some of my artists, what do you think of this? Oh, this is amazing, blah, 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 and what kind of techniques did he use there? And of course, the classics like Brahman, Vallejo, and whatnot, and learn to kind of speak their language. Programmers are weird, so they speak their own language, not just C++, and I find that the more I interact with them, the more they feel like Drax in Guardians of the Galaxy in regards to taking things very literally. And I go back to the old example of if you had a robot and you told the robot to go get you milk from the fridge, the robot wouldn't know what to do. You have to be like, okay, turn left 45 degrees, walk forward 3 meters, raise your right hand, open your hand, close it on the door, open it, grab the milk, et cetera, et cetera. They think and they walk through kind of the code in their head on all of their day-to-day interactions. And they all always have a God complex, I found. There's that old Alec Baldwin film called Malice, in which he's on trial for whether or not the surgery that he was working on as a cardiothoracic surgeon went well, and whether or not him having a God complex contributed to that. And I'm not going to do the monologue because I'm not an actor, I'm not Alec Baldwin, but look it up on YouTube. But he winds up ending it saying something along the lines of when your wife is on the table and I'm pumping her heart back to life with my hand, and you're in that church praying, who do you think you're praying to? You ask me if I have a God complex? I am God. And that's nearly every programmer I've ever interacted with. I'm not a very religious man, but if there is a God or gods, that person's probably a coder. And never forget, and this is one of my favorite things, I have it on mugs around the studio, that arguing with an engineer is like fighting a pig in mud, and after the first few hours, you realize they truly enjoy it. And they can go for days. So production, not exactly the most exciting, sexy thing to talk about, but it's important, especially if you're a creative. You're making the best game you can in the time frame. Respect production, loop in production whenever you make design decisions, because they will go crazy or get very grumpy very quickly, as we know. And everything's all trade-offs. We use the terrible term killing babies when we're removing features from games, because the game does kind of feel like your kid. And like, oh, okay, I have to lose the character with the spear. Darn it, can't do melee in this one. And good production saves money, saves time, and keeps the lights on. Animators are fantastic. They're one of the ones that are easy to talk to. And never forget, they're sometimes your best creatives. Some of the best directors at Pixar started as animators and storyboard artists over there. They understand emotion, they understand pacing, they understand cadence, verbal and otherwise. And they're good. So how do you include DreamWorks face there also? In audio, I could go on about audio, but it is really the thing that kind of cements your experience. Audio sometimes is taken for granted to the point where Jack, one of our audio designers, has a joke whenever we change something in the game. He's like, oh, it shouldn't affect audio. And he's like, yeah, right, because it ultimately will, because you need that good experience. So you respect the hell out of them. There's other disciplines that really matter, QA, IT, all of it. I could go on all day, but I only have an hour allocated, so let's keep moving. So a few years ago, I did this fun article. You could Google it on Gama Sutra called Game Developer Flashcards. It's kind of a follow-up homework for all of you, where it's kind of a few pages of how game developers argue. I'm not going to go through that right now, but I'd highly recommend looking it up, because at the time I was very frustrated at Epic Games, and this ultimately wound up being kind of like my therapy at the time. So look it up, and never forget, by the way, even when game developers agree, they often still fight. And I use the term, I'm violently agreeing with you. What are you talking about? And this image popped up on my Twitter feed a while back, which just kind of, from the hat to the beard to the glasses, they would just, even if the programmer doesn't have skin in the game, they argue. And sometimes you got to kind of direct it in the right direction. Also, know when to get outside help. We were having some communication issues at the studio. We brought in this woman, Susan, who's a professional coach. At first, it was kind of feeling like some cheesy office space, like, is this going to be like, the Bobs who are going to optimize our workflow? And she had such a great way about us that she kind of gave us all these tips about how to listen and how to communicate. And this one little thing called RASA, which is receive, appreciate, summarize, and ask. You receive someone's concerns about something, and you say, oh, so you're having problems with the graphics on level 3 or whatnot, and then you kind of ask them, what can I do to help you? And just by having that little bit of empathy, you'll find that people open up to you. It's basic, simple communication stuff, but with developers, it's surprisingly effective. So a mini rant time about just a couple battles I've been fighting as examples over the years. Bit of a side tangent. one of the things that I've been pushing for when it comes to character design that I learned from Dave Perry is character silhouette is everything. And using the example, of course, of Pokemon, it's not my generation, but I did get sucked into Pokemon Go recently, as we all did. It's one of those things you can look at those silhouettes of all those characters and pretty much know which Pokemon you're dealing with. And as wacky as some of those designs are, you pretty much know what you're getting when you see the silhouette on Pokemon Go. Detail versus clarity. I cite Halo as such a good example of this because over the years when we would play maps and gears that were white box, once we'd mesh them, we'd find the maps were less fun because they were too visually noisy. And one of the things working with the art team in Trammell on Lawbreakers is having a game that looks detailed, Unreal Engine, very impressive, nice lighting, but sometimes a well-lit wall is okay because when you're playing a fast-paced first-person shooter, you need to see what the hell's going on because 50 milliseconds is the difference between life and death. Same thing with weapons also, like I've had weapons designers that I've had to beat them down and like looking at their work because they will draw a first-person weapon from the side. And then once we get it in game, it looks like a random vacuum or like a weed like trimmer or something like that. And like if you're making a game about guns, a gun should look like a gun in down the barrel perspective. It's just one of those things I've had to fight continually for some weird reason throughout my career. And remember, if we groom and care for these developers, we can make magical things like VR happen. Had to throw a knock at Palmer from the Time magazine cover right there. And this is my transition into talking about virtual reality, which judging from that ancient photo, people have wanted to strap things to their face for quite some time. So, I've had some conversations with some of you around here about VR already, but like I said, I care about VR. I was fortunate enough to be an early investor in Oculus, which was a great thing, but I'm still seeing mistakes being made by the stakeholders and the shareholders in VR. I've wanted this shit since the 90s. I remember reading a Rolling Stone article about strapping something to your face and going to an entirely new reality, and I was like, oh my god, get me there, that sounds amazing. And then we wound up with The Lawnmower Man and Dactyl Nightmare, and then it just went and it became this novelty from the past. And so as it's kind of coming around again, I'm like, don't screw this up. Let's make this actually happen this time, people, because the good VR experiences that are out there are pretty magical. So I'm a dreamer. I always have been. I have a hard time sleeping. And when I do get good sleep, I go to all these crazy places. I go to multiple places repeatedly throughout my life in dreams that I've never been to in the real world. That's really weird shit going on there. And I tap into that sometimes with my creative aspects of what I work on all the way through to one of my first games, which was about a 10-year-old boy's dreams, which, as I said, sold five copies. So I'm a bit of a drinker, too. Those of you who know me, at the end of these shows, you'll find me having conversation, having a couple at the bar. And one of the things I've learned, especially at these conferences over the years, especially, ironically, the fact that I'm a big dreamer but I don't sleep well, which is kind of this weird juxtaposition, is the fact that I've learned over the years your brain is a computer. It's one big CPU, and at the end of the day when you're sleeping, your brain is compiling the code of your interactions and your experiences throughout the day. So anytime you numb that with any sort of substance, your brain is not allowing itself to compile and have the good stuff and the good creativity that comes through that's required for game development. So the funny thing is coming off of a conference like this where you're having a bunch of drinks for a few days in a row, is your dreams wind up being 5 times more intense and you wind up having these crazy dreams, which is your brain going into overdrive and compiling all the surplus code that you've had over the last few days. And I wound up kind of putting 2 and 2 together, reading about the history of the band Metallica. Metallica were famous back in the day for being big drinkers to the point where they called the band Alcoholica. They've all since cleaned up, which is why they're still alive these days. But I wound up listening to the song many years ago, Enter Sandman, which was about having crazy, intense dreams, and it clicked with me. That was Metallica cleaning up and dealing with their brain going into overdrive compiling. I'm getting into some heavy shit here, so bear with me. So one of the things that I've been practicing steadily since I was a child is getting into the experience of lucid dreaming. And for those of you that don't know, lucid dreaming is when you may have had it happen to you, you realize that you're dreaming, and you're like, shit, I'm dreaming. That's why that dinosaur is bearing down on me on fire or whatnot. And you get to the point where if you can realize that you're dreaming and not get too excited about it, you can start controlling and dictating the experience. Which in a weird way, the great VR experiences I've had really start to feel like lucid dreaming, which to me is pretty magical stuff, which is why I don't want everybody to screw this one up. So I sleep with an eye mask on. 42 years old and still learning how to get a good amount of shut-eye. And the eye mask has been very useful, but the weird thing that's kind of connected in my brain that has helped me actually be a better lucid dreamer is my brain subliminally thinks I'm wearing a Vive headset when I'm wearing that thing, which helps kick in the lucid dreaming, which is also extra effective when you pass out on a plane because it's like Inception where the plane kind of nudges you slightly awake, then you realize you're flying, and then in your dream you're doing barrel rolls, controlling the plane, and all sorts of things. So the weird thing about all this is virtual reality to me feels like lucid dreaming. I could go down the full Timothy Leary rabbit hole here and get into some weird, crazy hippie shit, but I'm not going to go any further than this, because later on, if you catch me, I'll try and give you my pitch about why I still think we're all in the Matrix, like Elon Musk says. So back to reality here. VR, it's just, for me, it's not just about games. The potential of what VR can do for seasonal affective disorder. You know, right now, those of you who live in areas that get really cold and dark during the winter, it's like, here, put this lamp on your desk. Like, how about putting the VR headset on and going to a beach? Or how about helping treat veterans for PTSD treatment, or giving people empathy of what it's like to be a prisoner in solitary confinement, to be in a 6 by 9 foot cell. There's a lot of very interesting applications here beyond games, and I really hope that we can continue to kind of bang on this and crack it open. And one of the other points here, and you know, I'm not even being paid by my former employer to say this, because the best VR looking experiences that I've had are in Unreal Engine 4. Unity is a very good engine, but when it comes down to it, you can't beat the fidelity of what Unreal Engine 4 brings to the table, or the lighting. And when I pick up that robot and hold it to my face in Robo Recall, that helps with immersion. When I give people the gateway drug of VR with Henry, and Henry walks out in front of them on Oculus, that's a pretty amazing experience. And same thing with Perfect, and being able to escape to these beautiful locations and really feel like that sense of presence. But great graphics cost money. And so I'm working on a VR pitch, and I've pitched it to several people, and I haven't had a lot of traction, because I'm not asking for the typical amount of $1 to $3 million that is funding a lot of VR games. I want to make something that is beautiful, that is more of a real game than a tech demo. And the truth of the matter is there's this massive chicken and egg thing that's going on in VR right now, where the shareholders are only putting out a little bit of money, and so they're getting games that feel like simple little tech demos instead of deep, double down upon experiences. And even John Carmack himself said a lot of VR right now is just coasting on novelty. Oh, hey, I picked up a milk can. That was exciting. What now? And so what you're seeing right now, and these are all fantastic games, but you're seeing this wave right now of this kind of wave shooter game, right? Where it's kind of like, oh, here's another wave of robots or zombies or whatnot. And they're great, fun games. And something clicked in my brain. VR, when it comes to the trajectory of gaming, is mimicking the arcade games of the 80s. So these games are basically Galaga, Robotron, and whatnot. These kinds of old school arcade experiences. So if you want to make a good VR game, start there, and let's start moving forward to figuring out what's next. So there are issues, though, that bother me. Loading times are one. Carmack himself was talking about this a while back. If you're going to put this darn thing on your head and potentially look like an idiot, you better entertain your grandma real quick if you're going to put it on her head at Christmas, because she's going to want to take that thing off her head really, really quickly. Of course, the install base and the cost of VR, it's still prohibitively expensive for most people. Again, the chicken and egg of like, well, do I want to make it when there's only 500,000 copies that I could even potentially sell? Is it even worth it? That's why the budgets are remaining in the $1 to $3 million space right now. And of course, if you want to do room scale VR, I'm in North Carolina. The money goes a lot further there. If you're in New York or Tokyo and whatnot, like you're not going to have a spare room just to throw a Vive in there. So keep that in mind. And of course, the setup. I got in a little bit of hot water for criticizing the Sony VR setup, because even that's a little bit clunky. But when it comes to Oculus, requires me to reset it up on the regular basis. Getting the Vive set up at your house, like, it's one of those things like, I'm old enough to remember VCRs. And your parents, all they could do is connect it to the TV and plug it in. They didn't even bother setting the clock. Do you think they're going to be mounting the Vive sensors on the walls? I mean, we need to... If I was in HTC, Valve, or Oculus's Facebook shoes, I would have kiosks at every physical retail location that I could, and a tech team that comes to your house and gets it set up and makes sure it's working properly. Because if VR doesn't work right, you hurl, you throw up, and you don't want to do it again. So other threats, there's a lot of crappy Me Too VR. That like Evo VR, like you could go to any sort of like electronics store and see all this like slapped together cheap Chinese electronics VR that's out there. The idea of VRC legs, people are like, oh, you just don't have your VRC legs. It's like, no, if you're saying that you're a developer and you fucked up and you didn't listen to the white papers of established VR experiences, using blinders with using motion or finding the proper ways to have locomotion in your game. The other thing that bothers me is jump scare VR. VR, as you know, is very intimate. If there's somebody standing in front of you, you really feel like they're in your space. So there's this trend right now of YouTubers. PewDiePie built his career on being scared by Slender Man, right? And so everybody wants a piece of that action. So, hey, let's put the headset on and film myself jumping and being scared by a big clown appearing in my face. Yeah, that works once, and then you never want to put the headset on again. And there's also a bit too many options going on right now. A lot of market confusion. The beauty of this, though, is that all the VR developers are sharing everything they're learning, and there's this kind of great communal thing happening because we all want VR to happen. So where I think VR is right now for the short term is I think it's kind of still in the realm of enthusiasts, kind of going back to like ham shortwave radio was back in the day. Those who have it, those who love it, are passionate about it. But I think short term, it's going to find its home in location-based entertainment, kind of like going to a Dave & Buster's or The Void, for example. It's these Utah-based folks that are doing their own standalone VR where you don't have a cable and you're in a warehouse, but when you're in VR, you touch the wall and it looks like the wall of a space station. They do all these amazing tricks to make you feel like you're on elevators or going down long hallways and puffing air on you and smells to really make it super immersive. So for the short term, I think location-based is where it's at. But ultimately, like all technology, it'll get better. It'll get faster. Just give it a little bit of time. And one thing that, talking about Facebook and Oculus, and Mark Zuckerberg's a smart guy. And he has always believed in the idea of sharing, sometimes to a fault. Facebook is dumb, but we all still use it. It's one of those things, when Zuckerberg saw Oculus, he didn't just see the tech demos or being on the beach or anything like that. He saw the experience of what it would be like to share space with somebody else, much like Ready Player One's Oasis. And I was fortunate a couple years ago to get an early demo of Touch from Palmer Luckey himself, and he was in the other room, and the second I beamed into VR and he was in front of me, even as a simple blue ghost, waving his fingers around, and then we were shooting Roman candles together and tossing a ball back and forth, that was a magical kind of transcendent experience. And my niece lives in California. I live in North Carolina. If I could get online and toss a ball back and forth between her while we put stupid Snapchat dog filters on our faces, that would be pretty fun. The other thing, ironically, I was just having a conversation about is there's a lot of weird social norms we're going to have to deal with in VR. And there was an article recently about somebody who's in an online experience. And of course, unfortunately, it's usually dudes because we can be dicks. Somebody came up to a woman in VR and started like rubbing on her and everything like that. These are the kind of things we have to account for in regards to people having kind of like a bubble and safe space around them when you have that true sense of presence. So keep an eye on that. So part 5 in conclusion, and back to my dog. Just a little bit of free advice. This is basic, obvious human stuff, but we as game developers sometimes tend to forget. I mean, one thing we've had at the studio being ruthlessly efficient is when we see something that we're working on to immediately point out what's wrong. Instead of saying, hey, I really like what you did with that character's hair, but can we work on the boots? Immediately we're like, the boots suck, fix it. And the artist is like, okay, I guess I'm a terrible artist. You need to give people a little bit of a cookie now and then. So be honest with people. I learned in my 30s to not lie to people because you lose track of what you told to who. So be yourself, be straightforward. I mean, there's a point when it comes to business dealings where you obviously can't share everything with everyone. Certain things have to remain confidential. But try and be yourself as much as you can. And don't be a dick. It's when I started the studio hiring Ardian, the COO, Tramel, the art director, between us, we could find out within 2 degrees of separation if the person applying at the studio was productive, or if they were an asshole, or if they were a psychopath, or any number of those things. So we've been able to weed out a lot of bad apples, because remember, it's a tiny, tiny business. You meet a lot of people at these shows. And remember to use open body language when you're talking to people. Don't close yourself off. Try to not put the arms like this. Try to avoid the hands in the pockets, especially when you're in a leads meeting or you're kind of holding court in a room in a company meeting. And give people a strong handshake. Look them in the eye, especially if you're in the process of bringing them on board because they're trusting their livelihood to your company. So I love this picture of Tramel because he looks sharp, but he also looks quizzical. And he and I had a conversation. He's like, dude, why do you still do this? I mean, I retired and, I could sit by the pool, hanging out, being bored. Like, and Tramel's like, I'd do that if I could. And I'm like, dude, you know what? I love this. I love the creative process. I love explaining a weapon or a character or an environment. And then a few days later, having that artwork show up on my desk. It really is an amazing high, unlike anything else. And I often cite at the end of shows such as this one, or especially the Game Developer Conference in San Francisco, because the place that people usually hang out in San Francisco is the W Hotel at the hotel bar. And I can spot our people. Like, some of y'all were in the airport with us when it was snowing, and I'm looking over, I'm like, those are probably devs. I can tell by the hoodies. And I love talking to all of you about game development, about pop culture, what your experiences, people you've worked with. And so whenever I go to have a beverage at the end of GDC, because I'm on the East Coast, the majority of the developers are on the West Coast. They fly out that final day. So I have one final night where it's just scraps of devs to hang out with. And those of you who know a W Hotel know that a W Hotel bar is usually filled with a certain amount of for lack of a better term, douchey characters. And so I have to like find the scraps of devs to like bond with that final night, and reminds me that I'd rather be around the majority of all of you than general population. And at the end of the day, it's like Lady Gaga, I live for the applause. You know, the feeling of standing in front of a line at a conference where people are lining up for hours to play the game that we worked so darn hard on, to be able to do a talk and have people, you know, enjoy it and share information, and to see people getting tattoos, the fans cosplaying, all of that. That's honestly what means the world to me. And this business, honestly, having had to suffer through the recent Fast and the Furious film, this business is family to me. It's one of those things that so many developers that I've known for even a year or two, we hug when we see each other. You know, I saw Phil Spencer at the Game Developer Conference and, you know, gave him a big old hug because when the Gears franchise was sold to Microsoft from Epic, he called me first. And it's that kind of level of respect and kind of friendship that we all have in this business. And yes, it's still a business, but it is very much family. You can't retire from your family. So, in conclusion, this is all coming together now. If we kind of avoid the typical grind of AAA, hopefully take care of developers and keep them healthy and happy, we can maybe actually make virtual reality happen, and then we can all, as a family, lucid dream together. So, thank you. Was that a perfect hour? Wow, I think that was actually an hour. How are we doing on time? Do we need to wrap it up?
15 more minutes.
A quick question or two, anyone? The first one's always the hardest. What's that? I wouldn't say weirdest. I'd say the recent one that I had was I was flying over what was like a very pixelated landscape where it was grass, but it still kind of had that Minecraft-y look to it. And it wasn't quite zero G, but it was kind of low gravity, and I felt like I was wingsuiting. And I was able to kind of like grab the grass and kind of fling myself around, and then kind of grab it and pivot around, and just kind of fly around this landscape like nights into dreams. And it was one of those things that, as it was going on, and I think the human brain when sleeping only can do it so long, that as the world started to like de-res and fade out, I was like, no, I want to keep doing this. And then I kind of woke up and was trying to force that to come back, and it wasn't happening. But one of the ones that always stuck with me, and this is a VR game that I still want to do. We've all had the nightmare of being chased by the monster, whatever kind of monster it is. Sometimes it's a very large creature like the kaiju in Pacific Rim or whatnot. But have it so you're running from this creature in VR and tie the emotive kind of headset that reads your brainwaves. And the more calm you get, the higher you can float away and get escape from the creature to kind of like teach like, you know, the tranquility and whatnot. I think it would be pretty easy to do. I just don't really have any spare time to do something like that. So, cool. Anyone else? I'm not. What is it? Oh, really? Is there a demo anywhere? Or? Okay. Yeah, so grab me afterwards. I'd love to chat about it. Yeah, cool. It's the wild, wild west out there right now in regards to VR, and just you're eventually going to get to the point where we're tracking where the eyes are going, and you know, cordless and everything. It's the 4K on-off resolution. It's going to get better and better. So cool. Well, thanks all. Appreciate it.